It was supposed to be an exciting day trip. Alcatraz Island, the infamous prison-turned-tourist destination, held a certain allure with its history, mystery, and tales of notorious inmates. Perched on a rocky outcrop in the middle of San Francisco Bay, it once served as a military fort, then a military prison, and finally, a maximum security federal penitentiary. The stories of its harsh conditions and the infamous criminals who lived there, like Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman of Alcatraz, drew visitors from all over the world. My friends and I decided to take the ferry from San Francisco on a chilly, overcast day in late November. The gray skies and occasional drizzle seemed fitting, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the place. As the ferry pulled closer, the silhouette of the penitentiary grew larger. Its weathered, pale stone walls, topped with rusting guard towers, stood in stark contrast to the churning, dark waters of the bay. Even with tourists milling about the deck, a heavy silence seemed to settle over everyone as we approached. Stepping off the ferry, I felt an immediate change in the air. It was colder here, sharper, and carried a salty tang. The island itself was small, just over 22 acres, with narrow pathways winding between crumbling buildings. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries cutting through the stillness. The guide told us the island's nickname, the Rock, came from its barren, rocky terrain, which made escape nearly impossible. The tour began in the administrative building. We passed the warden's office and the control room, where guards once monitored every movement in the prison. The guide pointed out the showers where incoming prisoners were stripped of their identities, both literally and figuratively. Alcatraz was designed to break its inmates, offering no privacy, no escape, and no solace. But it wasn't until we reached the cell blocks that the island's infamous reputation truly came to life. Cell Block B and Cell Block C were where most prisoners were housed, their tiny cells offering just enough space for a cot, a small shelf, and a toilet. The walls were painted in drab green and white, colors chosen to suppress emotions. As we walked past the rows of cells, I tried to imagine what it must have been like to live here, surrounded by the sound of clanging metal, footsteps echoing on concrete, and the occasional cry of a desperate inmate. Then we arrived at D Block, the solitary confinement area. This part of the prison was different. The cells here were darker, colder, and even smaller. The guide explained that D Block housed the most unruly prisoners, those who couldn't be controlled. Some of these cells, known as the Hole, were completely dark, leaving prisoners in pitch-black isolation for days or even weeks. The guide shared chilling tales of prisoners losing their minds in the Hole, some claiming to hear voices or feel ghostly touches. I laughed nervously, trying to brush off the stories as exaggerations meant to entertain tourists. But as the group spread out to explore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in D Block felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of countless untold stories. I wandered into one of the cells at the far end of the corridor, the kind prisoners once called iron tombs. The temperature inside was noticeably colder than the rest of the prison, and the silence was absolute, pressing against my ears. I ran my fingers along the rough concrete walls, imagining the despair that must have hung thick in this room. That's when I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, so intense that I could see my breath in front of me. My skin prickled, and an inexplicable wave of unease washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but a strange sense that I wasn't alone. As I stepped out into the corridor, I hesitated. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the cell was empty. I caught up with my friends who were a few cells away, laughing and taking pictures. I tried to join in, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange, cold presence I'd felt. The tour ended in the exercise yard, a wide, open space with crumbling walls and a breathtaking view of the San Francisco skyline. It was easy to see why prisoners said the yard was both a blessing and a curse. From here, they could glimpse freedom, so close, yet impossibly far. The guide mentioned that the waters surrounding Alcatraz were freezing, with strong currents that made escape nearly suicidal. As the sun began to set and the sky turned a murky orange, we boarded the ferry back to the mainland. The chatter among the group was lively, filled with jokes and stories about the day. I tried to join in, but my thoughts kept returning to the cell in D Block and the strange, chilling sensation I couldn't explain. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the narrow corridor of D Block, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. And then there was the sound, faint, almost imperceptible. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps echoing in an empty hallway. I told myself it was just my imagination, a lingering effect of the eerie atmosphere of the island. But deep down, I knew better. Something had stayed with me, not in the literal sense, but in a way that was harder to define. A memory, a fragment of Alcatraz's haunted past, clinging to me like a shadow. Alcatraz Island is a place steeped in history, a relic of a darker time. It's easy to see why people say it's haunted. Maybe it's the stories, or maybe it's the walls themselves, holding onto the echoes of the lives they've witnessed. I haven't been back since that day, and I'm not sure I ever will. But every now and then, on quiet nights, I think about that cell, the chill in the air, and the presence I felt. And I wonder, was it just my imagination? Or had I truly glimpsed one of the many restless souls who still call Alcatraz home? It was the summer of 1994, and I was only 9 years old, full of curiosity and more than a little sense of adventure. My family had just moved to a small town near the edge of the woods, a place where the streets were quiet and the air always seemed to carry a kind of peaceful stillness. The town had an old cemetery, the kind that people rarely visited except on special occasions, or when they had loved ones buried there. My father, a history buff, would often take me on walks around the town to teach me about its past. On one of those days, we wandered down to the cemetery, its old iron gates creaking as we pushed them open. The place had a strange charm about it. The gravestones were worn down with age, the paths covered in a blanket of fallen leaves, and the trees that towered over the graves whispered secrets with every gust of wind. I wasn't particularly interested in the cemetery. I didn't know any of the names on the gravestones, and most of them were so weathered I could barely make out the inscriptions. But my dad seemed to enjoy it, and I liked being out with him, even if it wasn't the most exciting place to explore. It was a hot afternoon, the kind where the air feels thick and the sun is just a little too much. As we walked further into the cemetery, something felt off, an eerie kind of quiet that settled over everything. It wasn't the normal peace you'd expect in a place like that. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, making it hard to breathe. We were strolling near an old section of the cemetery that was barely visited anymore. There were fewer gravestones here, and they looked even older, some of them cracked or toppled over. I remember asking my dad why no one seemed to come here anymore, and he told me it was because the section was from the earliest days of the town, and most of the families who had lived here were long gone. Then we heard it. At first it was faint, like a soft rustling in the distance. I turned to my dad, but he didn't seem to hear it. It was almost like a whisper, but it wasn't a wind or the trees. It was something different, something human, a cry, A baby's cry. I didn't know what to think. I had no idea why a baby's cry would echo through a graveyard. There were no houses around, no one who could be nearby. I tugged at my dad's sleeve. "Dad, did you hear that?" He looked at me, a little confused. I listened again, and the cry came once more, soft, desperate, almost like it was calling out for help. It came from somewhere deep within the cemetery, from the section we had been walking past only moments before. My heart skipped a beat. "Dad," I whispered, "there's a baby." He paused, listening for a moment. Then he shook his head, his face wrinkling with uncertainty. "It's just your imagination. There's no one here." But I knew what I heard. The cry was unmistakable, rising and falling like a baby in distress. The kind of sound that would make your heart ache if you were a parent. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I stood there, unsure of what to do next. The cry came again, louder this time, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. "Dad, we need to find out where it's coming from," I insisted, pulling on his arm. Reluctantly, my father gave in. We turned toward the section of the cemetery where the sound seemed to be coming from, our footsteps echoing across the graveyard. The cries seemed to grow fainter as we moved closer, almost like they were drifting away. But we kept walking, drawn to them, like magnets. As we rounded a bend in the path, we came to a small, secluded section of the cemetery that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The gravestones here were older than the rest, most of them completely worn away by the years. There were no flowers or wreaths, only the tall, overgrown grass that reached up toward the stones. That's when we saw it. A small grave, barely visible through the grass, marked by a simple, weathered stone. It was unlike the others, almost as if it had been neglected for years. The cries were louder now, as if they were coming from right beside us, but the graveyard around us remained empty. I looked at my dad, my eyes wide with confusion. "Why is there a grave here? I thought no one lived near this part of the cemetery." He frowned, kneeling down beside the grave. "It's strange," he muttered. "This doesn't look like the kind of grave you'd expect for a child." I couldn't stop staring at the gravestone. It didn't have a name, just a single word etched into it. Baby. No dates, no other markings, just that one word. We stood there for a few moments, both of us staring at the grave in silence. Then, to my surprise, my dad stood up, dusted off his pants, and said something I wasn't expecting. "Let's leave it alone," he said, his voice tight. "Some things are meant to stay undisturbed." I didn't question him. Something about that place felt off, like there was a history I wasn't meant to understand. We turned and walked away, back toward the gates of the cemetery. But the cries didn't stop. They lingered in my ears, even after we'd left the cemetery behind. Years later, when I was older, I found myself back in that same cemetery, this time with friends. We were exploring as teenagers often do, and we found ourselves in the same area where I'd been with my dad all those years ago. I didn't talk about what happened that day, what I heard, what I felt. It didn't seem important at the time. But when we passed that section of the cemetery, the same grave I had seen all those years ago caught my eye. The grass had grown around it, and the stone was more worn than before. But this time, something was different. There was a small, fresh flower placed on top of the grave. A single white daisy, delicate and new. I never found out who placed it there. I never heard the cries again, and I never spoke of it to anyone. But that moment stayed with me, like a piece of an unfinished puzzle. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. A small cabin tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains, miles from the nearest town. Just the five of us, with nothing but the fresh mountain air, the sound of trees swaying in the wind, and the warmth of a fire to keep us company. We arrived late in the afternoon, right as the sun was starting to set. The whole place felt peaceful and isolated, which was exactly what we needed. The cabin had that cozy, rustic charm, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and big windows that let us look out at the forest that surrounded us. That evening, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. It was quiet, peaceful, and felt like the world outside didn't exist. We played cards, laughed, and let the stress of life slip away, the kind of night where everything feels just right. But then around midnight, something happened that would change the whole weekend. It started as a small sound, so soft it could have been the wind or a branch brushing against the cabin. But then it came again, a faint, high-pitched laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make us stop what we were doing. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, looking up from her cards. I froze, listening. The laughter seemed to float in from the forest, just outside the cabin, almost like it was playing on the breeze. "Probably just an animal," Ryan said, but he didn't sound too sure of himself. We all tried to ignore it. We went back to the game, but none of us could fully focus. Every time there was a break in the conversation, the laughter would come again. It wasn't like the kind of laughter you hear on TV or in movies. It was odd, distant, and felt out of place. "Maybe it's another group of campers," Sarah suggested, shrugging it off. But the more we listened, the more it felt wrong. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? We tried to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that laughter in my head. It was faint, like it was just beyond my reach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was getting closer. At some point, I woke up. The fire had burned down to nothing but a few glowing embers, and the cabin was silent. But then, just as I was about to drift back to sleep, I heard it again. That laughter. Only this time it was much clearer. It was as though whoever or whatever it was right outside the cabin. I could feel my heart racing. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide, straining to listen. I wasn't the only one awake. Emma was sitting up too, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, and I nodded. "Where is it coming from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she said, her eyes darting around the dark room. We both turned to look at the window, but the darkness outside was thick, like a wall. Nothing moved. The trees stood still in the night, their branches gently swaying. Without a word, we both got up and tiptoed to the window. Ryan and Mark were still fast asleep in their beds, unaware of what was happening. We peered outside, our breath fogging up the glass. The forest seemed peaceful, even serene. But there was something unsettling about it too. The laughter came again, but this time it was closer. So close, I almost felt it. "Where is it coming from?" I whispered. Just then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something shifted between the trees, just at the edge of the light from the cabin. I couldn't make out what it was, but it wasn't like an animal. It was too deliberate, almost like it was pacing, waiting. My stomach churned with a deep sense of dread. I turned to Emma, my voice shaky. "Did you see that?" But when she looked, there was nothing. Just the quiet, dark forest stretching out in front of us. We both stood there for what felt like forever, not sure if we should wake the others or just ignore it and go back to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, just watching. The laughter never came again that night, but I don't think any of us really slept. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside made us jump. The peaceful silence of earlier was gone, replaced with a kind of heavy stillness. In the morning, The world looked completely different. The sun was up, casting golden light over everything, and the cabin felt like it had been waiting for us to wake up. But even with the warmth of daylight, I couldn't forget the sound of that laughter. We left the cabin early that day. No one said it out loud, but none of us wanted to stay another night. We packed our things quickly, made sure the doors were locked, and drove off, not looking back. We didn't talk about it much after that, but every time I think about that trip, the memory of that laughter still lingers. Even though we were far away from that cabin now, sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I can almost hear it again, soft and distant, just like it was that night. Maybe it was just our imagination, but I don't think so. Some sounds just don't feel right. And that laughter, it was one of them.